Ever heard of a school that's been both a military hospital and a place of learning during wartime?
Sounds a little unusual.
Yeah. Get ready to dive into a wild ride, the history of the Vinzentinum.
Not your typical school story.
Not even close. We're talking over 150 years of twists and turns.
What I find really interesting about the Vinzentinum is how its story is like a microcosm of European history.
Right.
We're going to trace its path, starting as this small seminary, battling a shortage of priests,
A common theme back then, it seems.
and becoming the modern coeducational place it is now. Quite the journey.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1867. Bishop Vinzenz Gasser, he's got a big problem on his hands. Not enough priests.
A real head-scratcher for a bishop.
What's a bishop to do? You got it. Start a brand new school.
Classic solution. This really highlights just how powerful the Catholic Church was in 19th century Europe.
They were major players.
Setting up these seminaries wasn't just about education, it was strategic.
Right. Address the clerical shortage and flex a little muscle.
Exactly. Solidified their authority, you could say.
So it's like, need more priests. Let's build a school and make it happen.
Basically.
And get this, by the early 1900s, 2/3 of their graduates were becoming priests.
Talk about an effective pipeline.
It's amazing they were that successful. But even then, in those early years, there are these subtle hints of changes to come.
Rat cracks in the foundation.
It makes you wonder, what was going on in the wider world that might have foreshadowed those changes? What was happening beyond the walls of the Vinzentinum?
Well, imagine Europe kind of on the edge of this new era. Liberalism, Protestantism gaining ground, challenging the old guard, the Catholic Church.
A real clash of ideologies.
And in that context, a seminary like the Vinzentinum, it wasn't just about education. It was about protecting their influence. They were trying to control the narrative.
Shape the future.
Exactly. Educating these young men in a really controlled environment. They wanted to make sure there were enough priests who followed their rules, their doctrines.
The whole generation of loyal followers? Makes sense. It's like a strategic counter move to the changing times.
Precisely.
And for a little while there, it seemed like it was working. But then along comes the 20th century.
With its own ideas about how things should be run.
And let's just say, the 20th century, it had other plans for the Vinzentinum. Plans no one could have predicted. But before we get ahead of ourselves,
We should probably pump the brakes a bit.
let's dive a little deeper into those early years first. So we left off with this picture of the Vinzentinum, humming along, doing its thing, training young men to join the priesthood.
A well-oiled machine, at least for a while.
Right. But then, as we hinted at, the 20th century arrives.
And things get a lot more complicated.
That's an understatement. The First World War, it was a turning point.
A massive one.
For the Vinzentinum, but for all of Europe, really.
Absolutely.
This institution, dedicated to knowledge, to spiritual growth, suddenly it's right in the middle of a global conflict.
The world turned upside down.
It really does make you stop and think, classrooms, quiet reflection, all that replaced by...
The chaos of war.
Exactly. It became a military hospital.
Could you imagine?
I can't even begin to fathom that shift.
It really shows you the impact of war,
How it touches everything.
Even places we think of as safe, peaceful schools, universities, they're all pulled in.
And for the Vinzentinum, it wasn't just the war they had to deal with.
Oh, no. Not even close.
There are huge political upheavals happening right on their doorstep, too.
Like a 1-2 punch.
So, World War I ends, the Treaty of Saint-Germain comes along and redraws the map of Europe.
And suddenly, South Tyrol, where our school is,
Yeah.
it's part of Italy.
Just like that.
Yeah.
A huge shock to the system, I imagine.
For everyone.
It's like going to bed in one country and waking up in another. I can't imagine trying to process that.
That sense of disorientation.
And for the Vinzentinum, this was massive. Here they are, this school with deep Austrian roots.
And suddenly they're trying to figure out this Italian education system.
Talk about a culture shock.
It was a whole new world.
And then, as if that wasn't enough,
As if things couldn't get any weirder.
the rise of fascism. Mussolini comes to power.
And suddenly, tolerance for anything different for other cultures, other viewpoints.
It wasn't exactly high on the priority list, was it?
Let's just say the fascist regime had its own ideas about how things should be run.
And the Vinzentinum, this symbol of Austrian heritage, they were in the crosshairs.
They became a target.
They faced so much pressure, so many restrictions from the fascist government.
It was constant.
And get this, they even lost their legal status for a time in the 1920s. Their own government wouldn't recognize them.
Can you imagine?
It's hard to wrap my head around it. They're dealing with the aftermath of a devastating war.
Trying to adapt to being part of a new country?
And then facing this outright suppression from their own government.
It's unbelievable they survived all that.
It really is a testament to their resilience, to their determination. But to survive, they had to adapt, make some really difficult choices.
They had to, just to keep going.
They even had to establish a separate institution, the Pollenum, over in Schwaz, Austria.
Because Austrian students weren't allowed to cross the border into Italy for their education anymore?
So they created a whole other school just to keep educating students? That's commitment.
It's incredible, isn't it?
They were determined to preserve their German language instruction, even with everything going on.
It was clearly important to them.
And thankfully, because of the Lateran Treaty, the one between Italy and the Vatican in 1929, they were able to hold on to that part of their identity.
It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless.
But it wasn't easy. Imagine graduating but having your diploma, your hard work,
Just ignored, not recognized.
by the state. Even celebrating their achievements, it came with its own set of challenges.
It's mind-boggling how they navigated all that turmoil.
It makes you wonder, how do they manage to hold on to their core values, their belief in education, in the middle of all that chaos? What lessons did they learn about adapting, about resilience, that we could learn from today? It's remarkable how they made it through those turbulent times between the wars, only to be faced with another global conflict. You almost can't make this stuff up.
Talk about bad timing. As if the looming threat of another world war wasn't enough, South Tyrol found itself right in the middle of this pact between Hitler and Mussolini.
A recipe for disaster.
Imagine the pressure cooker of tensions they were living under, having to choose between your heritage and your home, which many South Tyroleans sadly had to do. This led to a lot of people leaving, those who chose to align themselves with the German Reich.
It's a heart-wrenching situation no matter what side you're on.
And of course the Vinzentinum, they weren't immune to any of it.
Sadly, no. They lost a big chunk of their students because of it.
It was another blow, right after they had rebuilt. And then on top of that, their building, confiscated,
Not again.
turned into a military hospital.
Again. It's like history repeating itself.
That-
But this time it was even worse, wasn't it? The Nazis actually shut them down.
They did. The Nazis, with no regard for history or the school's purpose, they turned the Vinzentinum into a regular high school, just for boys. Completely erased its religious identity.
It's just wiped it away.
And the irony of it all, during Allied air raids, guess what the building was used as?
Let me guess. A military hospital.
You got it.
It's unbelievable. This school just couldn't catch a break. But, and I think we both know this, they always found a way to persevere. They rebuilt, they started over. How do you even begin to recover from something like that?
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The war ends, the diocese gets the building back, who knows what kind of shape it was in, and they had to work. They rebuild the Vinzentinum. Reopened as a private school, and showing they were willing to change with the times, they added a middle school in the 1960s.
Talk about a comeback story. They just refused to be kept down. But their transformation wasn't over yet, was it? Didn't you mention something about a pretty major change in who they allowed to attend?
This is where it gets really interesting. Remember why the Vinzentinum was founded? Priest shortage, right?
Yeah.
Fast forward to 1996. They make a decision, a bold one, that totally changes their identity.
Hit me with it.
They started admitting girls.
Wow, talk about a full 180. What led to such a dramatic shift after over a century as an all-boys school?
Well, society was changing. The demand for single-sex education was fading. The Vinzentinum, always willing to adapt, they recognized this and went for it. They embraced coeducation.
Makes sense. So they really leaned into the changing times, became the modern, multifaceted institution they are now.
Exactly. Today, the Vinzentinum, it's a fully recognized, accredited school with all sorts of programs. They even have a middle school that specializes in music.
From training priests to a beacon of modern education, embracing everyone, that is quite the journey.
It really is. And for me, what's most fascinating is how closely it mirrors European history. Wars, political upheaval, changing social norms, they weathered it all. They survived.
It's a good reminder that education, it's not this fixed thing confined to a classroom. It's alive, it changes with the world, and it constantly has to evolve to face new challenges.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Makes you think about where education is headed next, doesn't it? What can we learn from the Vinzentinum, from its ability to adapt and overcome? What's next for them? Something to think about. That's it for our deep dive into this one school's incredible journey.